The morning of September 9th, 1943, off the coast of Salerno, Italy, Lieutenant Commander Michael Tritton stood on the bridge of HMS Unicorn, watching Seafire Mark III's launch from the carrier deck. Each aircraft rolled forward, accelerated along the short flight deck, and clawed into the air with what seemed like impossible margins. The German pilots inland, preparing their Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190, as for combat patrols, had no reason to fear these carrier-based fighters. Everyone knew carrier aircraft were compromised, machines heavier, slower, burdened with arrestor hooks and strengthened undercarriages that robbed them of performance. The Luftwaffe pilots had faced American Wildcats and knew what to expect from naval fighters, decent enough for their purpose, but no match for land-based interceptors in a turning fight or high-speed chase. The British Seafires launching that morning would prove this assumption catastrophically wrong. Within hours, German pilots would find themselves in combat with carrier aircraft that could match their climb rate, exceed their maneuverability at medium altitudes, and most disturbingly chase them down in level flight, at speeds they had been assured were impossible for any fighter operating from a carrier deck. The question that would haunt German intelligence officers and tactical planners for the remainder of the war was simple. How had the British managed to put a fighter with performance matching the best land-based aircraft onto carrier decks? If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The answer lay in a series of engineering decisions made years earlier, compromises that somehow avoided compromising performance, and a determination to maintain capabilities that conventional wisdom said were incompatible with carrier operations. The Seafire Mark III could reach 352 miles per hour in level flight at altitude. It could climb at over 2,000 feet per minute. Its roll rate was exceptional. Its turning circle at combat speeds was tight enough to follow any German fighter through sustained maneuvers. These were not theoretical specifications. They were measured performance figures achieved by operational aircraft flying from carrier decks in combat conditions. German pilots encountered these capabilities firsthand over Salerno, over southern France during Operation Dragoon, in the Aegean, and along the Norwegian coast. Each encounter forced a recalculation of what they thought they knew about carrier aviation. The psychological impact went beyond tactical surprise. It represented a fundamental challenge to the Luftwaffe's understanding of the technological trade-offs inherent in naval aviation. If the British could field carrier fighters with performance-matching land-based aircraft, what other assumptions about Allied capabilities might be wrong? The story of how this happened, why German intelligence failed to anticipate it, and what it meant for pilots on both sides begins not with the Seafire itself, but with the aircraft it was derived from and the engineering philosophy that created it. In 1934, the British Air Ministry issued Specification F.3714, calling for a new single-seat fighter armed with 8 machine guns. Reginald Mitchell, chief designer at Supermarine Aviation Works, had been designing high-speed seaplanes for the Schneider Trophy races throughout the late 1920s and early 1930s. Those racing aircraft had taught Mitchell's team essential lessons about aerodynamic efficiency, stressed skin construction, and the importance of minimizing drag. Mitchell applied those lessons to the fighter design. The result was the Supermarine Spitfire, an aircraft that would become synonymous with British fighter aviation. The first prototype flew in March 1936. The Spitfire that entered service with the Royal Air Force in 1938 was a remarkably clean design. Its elliptical wing planform, while expensive to manufacture, provided excellent lift distribution and low drag. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, a liquid-cooled V12 producing over 1,000 horsepower, gave it performance that matched or exceeded contemporary German designs. The Spitfire's structure used stressed aluminum skin over a framework of formers and stringers, creating a light but strong airframe. Every aspect of the design prioritized performance. When war began in September 1939, the Spitfire proved itself in combat. During the Battle of Britain in 1940, Spitfires and Hurricanes defended British airspace against the Luftwaffe. The Spitfire could match the Messerschmitt Bf 109 in most performance categories and exceeded it in turning ability. German pilots learned to respect the Spitfire. It was fast, maneuverable, and well armed. Luftwaffe tactical doctrine adapted to account for Spitfire capabilities. Bf 109 pilots used their slightly better dive performance and higher altitude capabilities to maintain advantages where they could. But in level flight and in turns, the Spitfire was at least equal and often superior. By 1941, as the war expanded beyond Europe, the Royal Navy faced a critical problem. British aircraft carriers needed modern fighters, but the Navy's dedicated carrier fighters aircraft, like the Fairey Fulmar and the Blackburn Rock, were inadequate. They were too slow, too heavy, and insufficiently maneuverable to face modern land-based fighters. The Fulmar, a two-seat fighter derived from a light bomber design, could barely exceed 250 miles per hour. When operating near hostile shores, British carriers faced land-based German and Italian fighters that could destroy the fleet air arms existing fighters with impunity. The obvious solution was to adapt the Spitfire for carrier operations, but this presented enormous technical challenges. Carrier aircraft required strengthened undercarriages to withstand the violent impacts of carrier landings. They needed arrestor hooks to catch the wires stretched across carrier decks. They needed folding wings to fit in carrier hangars and on deck parks where space was desperately limited. They needed increased structural strength throughout the airframe to handle catapult launches and the stress of deck operations. Each modification added weight. Each addition of naval equipment reduced performance. The fundamental question facing Supermarine's designers was whether a navalised Spitfire would retain enough performance to be worth the effort. If adapting the Spitfire for carriers reduced its speed by 50 miles per hour and degraded its climb rate and manoeuvrability proportionally, the result would be just another inadequate naval fighter, better than the Fulmar perhaps, but still compromised. Supermarine received a contract to attempt the conversion. The first naval variant, designated Seafire Mark IB, was essentially a standard Spitfire Mark VB fitted with an arrestor hook and catapult spools. These aircraft entered service in June 1942 aboard HMS Furious. They retained most of the Spitfire's performance, but they lacked folding wings, limiting how many could be carried aboard carriers. The non-folding wings meant that fewer Seafires could fit in carrier hangars compared to purpose-designed naval fighters. The Seafire Mark II, introduced later in 1942, incorporated stronger undercarriage and additional reinforcement, but still lacked folding wings. Pilots who flew these early Seafires discovered that despite the added weight of naval equipment, the aircraft retained the Spitfire's essential characteristics. It was still fast, capable of over 330 miles per hour at an altitude. It still climbed well and turned tightly. The compromises necessary for carrier operation had not destroyed the fundamental performance that made the Spitfire exceptional. But the lack of folding wings remained a critical limitation. British carriers could embark only small numbers of Seafires, reducing their effectiveness as carrier fighters. What the fleet air arm needed was a Seafire variant with folding wings that could be carried in useful numbers while maintaining the performance that made the aircraft valuable. The Seafire Mark III, introduced in early 1943, solved this problem through careful engineering that preserved performance while adding the necessary naval capabilities. The Seafire Mark III represented Supermarine's most sophisticated attempt to balance carrier requirements with fighter performance. The design team, led by Joseph Smith, who had succeeded Reginald Mitchell after Mitchell's death in 1937, faced a precise engineering challenge. The wing needed to fold to reduce the aircraft's span from 36 feet 10 inches to approximately 13 feet 6 inches when folded. This would allow carriers to embark meaningful numbers of Seafires, rather than the handful that non-folding variants permitted. The folding mechanism added weight approximately 125 pounds of hinges, locking pins, and reinforcement structure. But Smith's team designed the fold to occur just outboard of the undercarriage, minimizing the structural complications. The wing folded upward, manually operated by deck crews, with the outer sections rotating to lie nearly vertical alongside the fuselage. The Mark III also incorporated a strengthened arrestor hook assembly and reinforced fuselage structure around the hook attachment points. The undercarriage received further strengthening with redesigned oleo struts capable of absorbing the severe compression forces of carrier landings. These landings were controlled crashes. Aircraft descended at over 600 feet per minute onto moving decks, caught arrestor wires, and decelerated from approach speed to zero in approximately 2 seconds. The forces involved would destroy conventional landing gear. The power plant remained the Rolls-Royce Merlin, but the Mark III variants used either the Merlin 45 or the more powerful Merlin 55. The Merlin 55, installed in the Seafire LF Mark III variant, produced 1,585 horsepower at 6,000 feet using a Bendix-Stromberg pressure carburetor that eliminated the negative G fuel flow problems that had plagued earlier Merlin engines. This engine gave the LF Mark III exceptional low-altitude performance, optimized for the combat environment where carrier fighters typically operated. The aircraft's combat weight reached approximately 7,300 pounds, fully loaded with fuel and ammunition. For comparison, the land-based Spitfire Mark V weighed approximately 6,600 pounds in similar configuration. The additional 700 pounds represented the cumulative weight of naval equipment, folding wings, arrestor hook, catapult spools, reinforced structure, and additional equipment required for overwater operations. Despite this weight penalty, the Seafire Mark III achieved performance figures that would have seemed impossible to naval aviation experts just years earlier. Maximum speed at 15,000 feet reached 352 miles per hour. At lower altitudes, where the Merlin 55 supercharger was optimized, the LF Mark III could reach 342 miles per hour at sea level. Rate of climb exceeded 2,100 feet per minute. Service ceiling reached 33,000 feet. Range, always limited on Spitfire variants due to fuel capacity constraints, was approximately 465 miles on internal fuel. This range limitation was acceptable for carrier operations, where aircraft operated within relatively short distances from their ships. The armament consisted of two 20mm Hispano cannon with 120 rounds per gun, plus 4.303-inch Browning machine guns with 350 rounds per gun. This firepower was devastating against aircraft and could be effective against light surface targets during ground attack missions. The Seafire Mark III entered squadron service in early 1943. Initial operations revealed both the aircraft's capabilities and its limitations. The narrow-track undercarriage, inherited from the Spitfire design, made ground handling difficult, particularly on carrier decks, where space was limited and deck motion complicated takeoffs and landings. The limited fuel capacity meant Seafires required careful management of combat air patrol durations. But when Seafires encountered enemy aircraft, their performance proved exceptional. Operation Avalanche, the Allied amphibious assault at Salerno, Italy, began on September 9, 1943. The landing force included American and British troops supported by naval gunfire and carrier-based aviation. HMS Unicorn, illustrious, formidable, and the escort carriers Attacker, Battler, Hunter, and Stalker provided air cover. These carriers embarked Seafire Mark III's alongside American Wildcats and British Martlets. The Luftwaffe response to the invasion was immediate and powerful. German units based at airfields around Naples and Foggia sent Messerschmitt Bf 109s, Focke-Wulf 190 As, and Junkers Ju-88 bombers against the invasion fleet and landing beaches. German pilots expected to face the usual Allied carrier fighters capable defensive aircraft, but hardly threats in aggressive combat. On September 10th, Seafires from 807 Naval Air Squadron flying from HMS Unicorn intercepted a formation of German aircraft approaching the fleet. The engagement occurred at approximately 15,000 feet. The German pilots, flying Bf 109Gs, initiated standard defensive maneuvers when they spotted the British fighters. The Bf 109G, powered by the Daimler-Benz DB605 engine producing 1,475 horsepower, was capable of 386 miles per hour at 23,000 feet. At the engagement altitude, the Bf-109 held a slight speed advantage in level flight, but the Seafire pilots weren't interested in level flight. Sub-Lieutenant Ronnie Hay, flying Seafire LR Mark III serial number MA970, pursued a Bf-109 that attempted to dive away after the initial contact. The German pilot, confident his aircraft could outdive the British carrier fighter, pushed his stick forward. Hay followed. The Seafire, despite its naval equipment and added weight, could match the Bf-109's dive characteristics. When the German pilot leveled out at 8,000 feet and attempted to extend away, expecting the heavier naval fighter to fall behind, Hay's Seafire remained in pursuit. The combat report filed after the mission noted that Hay closed to firing range, engaged with cannon and machine gun fire, and observed strikes on the Bf-109's wing route and fuselage. The German aircraft streamed coolant, a sign of damage to the liquid-cooled engine, and descended in a controlled glide toward the coast. Other engagements that day produced similar results. Seafires from 880 Squadron, flying from HMS Formidable, intercepted FW-190 as, attacking Allied ships. The Focke-Wulf 190A, powered by a BMW radial engine producing 1,700 horsepower, was one of the Luftwaffe's premier fighters. It excelled at high speeds and could absorb significant battle damage. German pilots trusted the FW-190's rugged construction and powerful armament. Lieutenant Peter Bramwell engaged an TW-190, attempting to escape after making a strafing run on a destroyer. Bramwell's combat report described closing from astern, the Seafire easily matching the TW-190's speed in level flight at 12,000 feet. When the German pilot realized he couldn't outrun the pursuing fighter, he initiated a turning fight. The Seafire's lower wing loading and excellent power-to-weight ratio gave it decisive advantages in sustained turns. Bramwell followed the WWII through a series of increasingly desperate maneuvers. After 3 complete 360-degree turns, Bramwell achieved firing position. His 20mm cannon rounds struck the FW-190's wing and cockpit. The German aircraft rolled inverted and descended trailing smoke. These engagements, documented in squadron records and combat reports now held at the National Archives in Kew, revealed a pattern. German pilots were encountering carrier-based fighters with performance they had not anticipated. The tactical assumptions built on experience with earlier Allied carrier fighters that naval aircraft would be slower, less maneuverable, and generally inferior to land-based fighters proved catastrophically incorrect when applied to Seafires. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Luftwaffe's intelligence assessment of Allied carrier aviation had been built on reasonable foundations. German pilots had extensive experience fighting American carrier fighters, primarily the Grumman F-4F Wildcat in the Mediterranean and Atlantic. The Wildcat was a capable defensive fighter, but clearly inferior to contemporary Bf-109s and FW-190s in speed and climb performance. The Wildcat's maximum speed of 318 miles per hour at 21,000 feet meant that German fighters could choose whether to engage or disengage. If a Bf-109 pilot found himself in an unfavorable position, he could dive away or extend in level flight, confident the Wildcat couldn't follow. This experience shaped Luftwaffe tactical doctrine for engaging carrier fighters. The standard approach was to exploit superior speed and climb rate, attack from advantageous positions, and disengage before the naval fighters could respond effectively. Against Wildcats, this doctrine worked well. German bomber formations operating with fighter escort could be confident that even if Allied carrier fighters intercepted them, the escorts could protect the bombers while the high-performance fighters dealt with the defenders. The appearance of Seafires disrupted these assumptions completely. Intelligence reports from pilots returning from Salerno described carrier fighters that could match Bf-109 performance. Initial reports were treated with skepticism. Combat is chaotic, and pilot observations under stress are notoriously unreliable. The intelligence officers analysing these reports assumed the pilots had encountered land-based Spitfires that happened to be operating near the carrier task force, not actual carrier-based aircraft. But as more missions were flown and more encounters occurred, the pattern became undeniable. British carrier fighters were achieving performance that matched or exceeded German expectations for land-based aircraft. The reports described aircraft with elliptical wings, clearly Spitfire-type fighters operating from carriers visible on the horizon. German reconnaissance aircraft photographed British carriers with Seafires on their decks, confirming that these high-performance fighters were indeed carrier-based. Luftwaffe intelligence officers faced an uncomfortable conclusion. Either British engineering had achieved something German aviation experts believed impossible, maintaining high performance in a navalised fighter, or German assessments of the trade-offs, inherent in carrier aviation, were fundamentally flawed. The truth was both. British engineers had successfully minimised the performance penalties of carrier adaptation through careful design, and German intelligence had underestimated British engineering capabilities. The Luftwaffe's response to Seafire capabilities evolved through the autumn of 1943 and into 1944. German fighter units operating in the Mediterranean received updated intelligence briefs describing Seafire performance characteristics. Pilots were instructed to treat carrier-based Spitfires with the same respect they afforded land-based variants. This was a significant shift in tactical thinking. Previously, encountering carrier fighters meant engaging targets that could be dominated through superior performance. Now, German pilots had to approach engagements with British carriers, knowing the defending fighters were legitimate threats. The tactical implications extended beyond individual combat. German bomber formations attacking Allied shipping now required stronger fighter escorts. Mission planning had to account for the possibility that British carriers in the area would launch fighters capable of intercepting and engaging German aircraft on equal terms. The calculations that went into deciding whether to attack a particular convoy or amphibious force now included assessments of carrier-based fighter strength that were fundamentally different from earlier in the war. During Operation Dragoon, the invasion of southern France in August 1944, Seafires from HMS Emperor, Khedive, Pursuer, Searcher, and Attacker flew combat air patrols over the landing beaches and provided fighter cover for the invasion fleet. German units based in southern France attempted to attack the amphibious forces. On August 15th, Seafires from 809 Squadron intercepted Dornier, Do-217s attempting to bomb landing craft. The engagement occurred at 12,000 feet. The German bombers, escorted by Bf-109s, expected to face typical carrier fighter opposition that their escorts could handle while the bombers completed their attack runs. Instead, the Seafires tore through the escort fighters, downing 2 Bf-109s in the initial pass, then pursued the bombers. The Do-217s, capable of only 290 miles per hour at altitude, had no chance of escaping. 3 bombers were shot down before reaching their targets. The remaining aircraft jettisoned their bombs and turned back toward their bases. German air activity over the Dragoon landing beaches decreased sharply after the first 2 days. Luftwaffe commanders recognized that attacking well-defended amphibious forces protected by carrier fighters with Seafire-level performance was prohibitively expensive. Aircraft losses in exchange for minimal damage to the invasion fleet represented an unacceptable trade-off. The Seafire's presence didn't prevent German air attacks entirely, but it made them costly enough that German commanders had to carefully consider whether each mission was worth the expected losses. For British Fleet Air Arm pilots, the Seafire represented both capability and challenge. The aircraft's performance made it a joy to fly in combat. Pilots, transitioning from Wildcats or Fulmars to Seafires, found themselves in fighters that could compete with anything the enemy flew. Sub-Lieutenant Richard Reynolds, who flew Seafires with 887 Squadron in 1944, later recalled that the Seafire was the finest fighter he ever flew. Its responsiveness, acceleration, and handling characteristics were exceptional. In combat, it gave him confidence that his aircraft wouldn't let him down. But the Seafire's carrier landing characteristics remained problematic throughout its service life. The narrow-track undercarriage made deck landings difficult even for experienced pilots. The aircraft had a tendency to bounce on landing, and if it bounced with one wheel touching down before the other, the torque from the propeller could flip the aircraft onto its back. Deck landing accidents were common. During Operation Avalanche, multiple Seafires were lost to landing accidents more than were lost to enemy action. Pilots had to approach the carrier deck at approximately 75 miles per hour, maintaining precise control while compensating for deck motion, wind conditions, and the turbulence created by the carrier's superstructure. The margin for error was minimal. A slightly misjudged approach could result in a crashed aircraft and an injured or killed pilot. Despite these challenges, Seafire squadrons maintained operational effectiveness. Deck crews became expert at recovering damaged aircraft and returning them to service. Pilots developed techniques for managing the difficult landing characteristics. The Fleet Air Arm accepted the higher accident rate as the price of having a fleet fighter with genuine combat capability. The German failure to anticipate Seafire capabilities reflected broader problems with Luftwaffe intelligence and technical assessment during the war. German aviation experts understood the theoretical trade-offs involved in adapting high-performance fighters for carrier operations. Additional weight-reduced performance, structural strengthening added complexity and cost. Naval equipment compromised the aerodynamic cleanliness that high-speed aircraft required. These were fundamental principles of aircraft design, validated by Germany's own experience attempting to develop carrier fighters. The Messerschmitt Bf-109T variant, developed for Germany's never-completed carrier Graf Zeppelin, incorporated folding wings, arrestor hook, and catapult equipment. The modifications increased weight by approximately 800 pounds, and reduced maximum speed by about 15 miles per hour compared to land-based Bf-109s, German. Engineers considered this performance penalty acceptable but significant. They assumed other nations faced similar trade-offs when navalizing their fighters. The British approach with the Seafire demonstrated that careful engineering could minimize these penalties more effectively than German experts had predicted. Supermarine's design team managed to add naval equipment while maintaining the fundamental aerodynamic efficiency that gave the Spitfire its performance. The elliptical wing's excellent lift-to-drag ratio remained unchanged by the folding mechanism. The Merlin engine's power output was preserved despite the additional weight the aircraft had to carry. The result was a carrier fighter that performed like a land-based fighter, something German intelligence assessments had suggested was impossible. This failure of technical intelligence had consequences beyond individual air combat engagements. It reflected a pattern where German military leaders underestimated Allied engineering capabilities and industrial sophistication. The same pattern appeared in assessments of American industrial production, Soviet tank design, and British radar technology. German commanders repeatedly found themselves surprised by Allied capabilities that, in retrospect, should have been predictable, given the resources and technical expertise available to the Allied powers. The Seafire story was one example among many, but it illustrated the problem clearly. British engineers had solved a difficult technical challenge, maintaining fighter performance in a navalised airframe, and German intelligence had failed to recognise this achievement until German pilots encountered the results: combat. By 1945, as the war in Europe approached its conclusion, Seafires were operating in multiple theatres. In the Pacific, British carriers including HMS Indefatigable, Victorious, Formidable, and Indomitable embarked Seafire squadrons as part of the British Pacific Fleet. These aircraft flew combat air patrols, provided fighter escort for strike aircraft, and engaged Japanese fighters over Okinawa and during operations against the Japanese home islands. The Seafire Mark III's performance proved valuable in the Pacific theatre, where Japanese fighters like the Mitsubishi A6M0 emphasized maneuverability over speed and armor protection. The Seafire could match the Zero's turning ability while offering superior speed, dive performance, and structural strength. British pilots who had previously flown Wildcats or Hellcats found the Seafire's dogfighting capabilities particularly useful against Japanese opponents. However, the limited range that had been acceptable for Mediterranean operations became a significant constraint in the vast distances of the Pacific. Seafires required careful fuel management and couldn't match the endurance of American fighters like the F-6F Hellcat or F-4U Corsair. British carriers operating Seafires had to position themselves closer to targets than American carriers, accepting increased risk to allow their shorter-ranged fighters to reach combat areas and return safely. The Seafire remained in Royal Navy service after the war, with improved variants including the Mark XV and Mark XVII entering service in 1945 and 1946. These later Marks incorporated more powerful engines, redesigned undercarriages that partially addressed the landing difficulties, and other improvements based on operational experience. The final variant, the Seafire Mark XLVII, served into the early 1950s before being replaced by jet fighters. The story of German pilots encountering Seafire Mark IIIs reveals truths that extended far beyond individual air combat engagements. It demonstrated how intelligence failures based on theoretical assumptions could produce dangerous tactical surprises. German aviation experts knew the principles of aircraft design and understood the compromises required for carrier operations. They applied this knowledge to predict Allied carrier fighter capabilities and concluded that naval fighters would necessarily be inferior to land-based aircraft. This conclusion was reasonable, but wrong. The Luftwaffe's tactical doctrine for engaging Allied carriers was built on this flawed foundation. German pilots approached encounters with carrier-based fighters confident they held decisive performance advantages. When Seafires demonstrated capabilities that matched or exceeded these expectations, German pilots had to rapidly revise their understanding of what they faced. This revision came at a cost measured in aircraft lost and missions failed. The psychological impact paralleled experiences elsewhere in the war, where German forces encountered Allied capabilities that contradicted their expectations. German tankers discovering that American Shermans were available in overwhelming numbers. German submariners, realizing Allied radar technology had neutralized the U-boat advantage. German infantry facing Soviet artillery concentrations that exceeded anything in German doctrine. In each case, the pattern was similar initial confidence based on reasonable assumptions, followed by combat encounters that revealed the assumptions were incomplete or incorrect, leading to forced adaptation under combat conditions. The Seafire represented British engineering excellence applied to a specific problem. Supermarine's design team understood both the Spitfire's strengths and the requirements of carrier operation. They found ways to combine these seemingly incompatible demands without destroying the performance that made the Spitfire valuable. The result was an aircraft that could operate from carrier decks while fighting effectively against the best land-based fighters Germany could field. For the German pilots who encountered Seafires over Salerno, southern France, the Aegean, and Norway, the experience was one more indication that the war was not progressing as their leaders had promised. German propaganda emphasized technological superiority and the fighting quality of German forces. Combat experience increasingly contradicted these claims. Facing carrier fighters that performed like land-based aircraft was another piece of evidence that Allied industrial and engineering capabilities exceeded what German intelligence had predicted. The men who climbed into their Bf-109s and FV-190s each morning knew they faced opponents with excellent equipment, strong numerical superiority, and tactical advantages. The knowledge that even Allied carrier fighters' aircraft operating under the constraints of naval aviation could match German performance was demoralizing. It suggested that no technological advantage remained, that German forces would face capable opponents wherever they operated, and that the industrial and engineering gap between Germany and the Allies was too wide to overcome through tactical skill or operational excellence. The Seafire Mark III's 352 miles per hour maximum speed was more than a technical specification. It represented the material reality of industrial warfare, where engineering, sophistication, and manufacturing capacity determined outcomes as surely as pilot skill or tactical doctrine. German aces had learned to respect the Spitfire over Britain in 1940. They learned to respect the Seafire over Italy and France in 1943 and 1944. The respect came from direct experience in combat, where the aircraft's capabilities were demonstrated in the most definitive way possible, through engagements where German pilots found themselves unable to exploit advantages they had expected to hold. That morning in September 1943, watching Seafire's launch from British carriers off Salerno, German pilots inland could not have known what awaited them. Within hours, they would discover that their assumptions about carrier fighter capabilities were dangerously wrong. The revelation would come not through intelligence briefings or technical analysis, but through combat, where the cost of wrong assumptions was measured in aircraft lost and pilots killed. The lesson was clear, though it came too late to change the war's outcome. Underestimating Allied engineering and industrial capabilities was a mistake Germany could not afford. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.